Pain is unavoidable, but suffering is not. That distinction is rarely explained, and because it isn't, most people live their entire lives confused by their own reactions. Something happens, a loss, a rejection, a harsh word, a setback. There is a natural response to this, a sensation in the body, tightness, discomfort, emotional pain. That part is real, and that part is human. But what usually follows is something else entirely. The mind begins to replay the event, to argue with it, to demand that it should not have happened. This isn't fair. This shouldn't be happening. I can't accept this. And in that moment, a second layer of pain is created, not by the event, but by resistance. This is the difference between emotional pain and psychological pain. Emotional pain is the body's response to reality. It rises, it peaks, and if left alone, it passes. Psychological pain is created when the mind refuses reality, when it argues with what already is, when it turns a moment into a story and a feeling into an identity. This is why two people can experience the same event and suffer completely different amounts. One feels the pain, then lets it move through them. The other feels the pain, then traps it inside thought. The Stoics were precise about this. They never promised a life without pain. They promised freedom from unnecessary suffering, because the first pain may be unavoidable, but the second one is optional. And once you learn to tell the difference, everything begins to change. What turns emotional pain into suffering is not the event itself, it is the meaning the mind attaches to it. This is where most people lose control without ever realizing it. Something happens, and before the feeling even settles, the mind adds a judgment. This shouldn't have happened. This means something is wrong with me. This proves I've failed. That judgment feels automatic, but it isn't. It is learned, conditioned, repeated so often that it feels natural. The Stoics called this moment the point of assent. The instant the mind agrees with a thought and treats it as truth. Pain alone does not require assent. Suffering does. When you agree with the story the mind tells, the pain no longer moves through you. It stays. It loops. It grows. It becomes personal. This is why psychological pain lasts longer than emotional pain ever could. The body reacts to reality. The mind reacts to interpretation, and interpretations can be questioned. But most people never question them. They assume every thought deserves belief, every feeling deserves obedience. So the mind keeps feeding the pain with explanations, predictions, and imagined futures. This will never get better. I can't handle this. This always happens to me. None of these statements are facts, they are judgments. And the moment you see them as judgments, their grip weakens. Stoicism is not about denying pain. It is about refusing to cooperate with unnecessary suffering. You cannot stop the first sensation, but you can stop the second story. That is where control begins. Once the mind assents to a judgment, it rarely stops at just one. It begins to multiply the pain. One thought becomes 10. One moment becomes a narrative. One feeling becomes a conclusion about your life. This is how suffering expands. The Stoics noticed something precise. The mind does not experience pain once. It re-experiences it through memory, anticipation, and imagination. The event happens once, but the mind revisits it repeatedly. You replay the moment, what was said, what should have been said, what might happen next time. None of this is happening now, but the body reacts as if it is. This is why psychological pain feels heavier than the original emotion. It is not tied to the present. It is fed by thought. The mind treats imagined scenarios as if they are real threats. So the nervous system stays activated. The pain stays alive. This is not weakness. It is how the mind has been trained. Most people mistake this process for depth. They believe thinking more means understanding more, but the Stoics saw it differently. They saw rumination as a form of resistance. Resistance to reality, resistance to uncertainty, resistance to accepting what already happened. The mind says, if I think about this enough, I can undo it, control it, or protect myself from it. But all it really does is keep reopening the wound. Pain does not need repetition, suffering does. And this is the moment where awareness becomes essential, because if you do not notice when the mind begins to replay, you will mistake repetition for necessity. You will believe the pain must stay because the thoughts keep returning. But thoughts return by habit, not by importance. Once this is understood, a different relationship with pain becomes possible. Not avoidance, not suppression, but observation. And that observation is the turning point. The Stoics did not try to eliminate pain. They focused on responding to it correctly. Once you see the difference between emotional pain and psychological pain, your task becomes simple but not easy. You stop arguing with the first sensation, and you stop feeding the second one. When pain appears, the Stoic response is not suppression, it is acknowledgement. This hurts, this is uncomfortable, this is unpleasant. Nothing more needs to be added. The moment you resist the feeling, the mind steps in to protect you, and protection quickly becomes exaggeration. But when you allow the sensation to exist without commentary, it begins to lose its urgency, not because you forced it away, but because you stopped interfering. The Stoics practiced this through attention. They watched sensations arise without labeling them as threats, failures, or injustices. They understood that pain has a natural cycle. It rises, it changes, it fades. Suffering interrupts that cycle by keeping pain mentally alive. This is why Stoicism emphasizes presence, not as a spiritual idea, but as a practical discipline. When attention is anchored in the present, the mind has less room to replay the past or fear the future. Pain may still be felt, but it is no longer multiplied. This does not make you passive, it makes you efficient. Energy is no longer wasted on resistance and rumination. It is conserved, and that conservation is what creates inner strength. You are not becoming numb, you are becoming precise, and precision is what separates endurance from suffering. At this point, something should feel different, not dramatic, not emotional, clearer. You've seen that pain itself is not the real problem. The problem is what happens after pain appears, the moment the mind adds a story, a judgment, a demand that reality should be different. Physical pain arrives on its own. Psychological pain is something we continue. And once you see this distinction, you stop fighting the wrong battle. You stop trying to eliminate discomfort. You stop resisting every unpleasant sensation. You stop turning temporary pain into a permanent struggle. Instead, your attention shifts inward to the moment where suffering is either created or allowed to dissolve. This is where Stoicism becomes practical. The Stoics never promised a life without pain. They promised freedom from unnecessary suffering, not by numbing yourself, not by suppressing emotion, but by removing the false judgments that keep pain alive. When something hurts, you no longer ask, "Why is this happening to me?" You ask something more precise, "What am I adding to this experience?" That single question changes everything. It creates space, distance, choice. Pain can still exist, but it no longer controls you, and this is where most people misunderstand emotional strength. They think strength means feeling less. It doesn't. Strength means not being dragged by every sensation, not obeying every internal impulse, not turning discomfort into identity. You don't become colder, you become clearer. Calm isn't the absence of pain, It's the absence of unnecessary resistance. This is why Stoicism doesn't make you passive. It makes you efficient. You conserve energy. You respond instead of react. You stop leaking attention into things that never deserved it. And once you master this distinction between pain and the story you attach to it, another question naturally appears. Why does anger feel so powerful in the moment? Why does it feel like strength, even when it leaves you weaker afterward? In the next video, we go one layer deeper. We examine how suffering is rarely created by events, but by the opinions we attach to them, especially the opinions of others. When you understand how judgments quietly shape distress, you begin to see why freedom was never about control, but about detachment. That's where real calm starts to form.